for, but he's heard me in a meeting at Lake Norman before and heard me this morning, so he knows. And now you know. We had a deacon one time at Estes who said, "I'll tell you what the problem is with you and with your preaching partner, Brother Roy. We've been together at two different congregations, the Henderson Church now, for 31 years, but he says, I can tell you what the problem is with you guys. You guys are accustomed to teaching 1 hour and 20-minute classes. And at the very minimum, 50-minute classes. You're not in church, or not in school when you come out here to church, you know. You're supposed to practice a limit. But I appreciate hearing Rob. My first opportunity to hear him, and I knew it'd be great, and I'm thankful for it. And I'm thankful for each of you. I want to say more about that before we close today. But I know that if I were to take an hour, you're not going anywhere because you know there's lunch out there. I know you. And if I could take, Dave, advantage of one other husband-wife story, do y'all mind? I know of a gentleman, I just see him right now. Gone to his reward, as is his wife. And in fact, they had been married, I think, 65 years or so. But he was the quietest and meekest little guy. I mean, if he were 5'6", I would probably be exaggerating. There was nothing physically that he could not do. I'm talking about in terms of skills. If you needed something done, electric, plumbing, carpentry, I mean, he just could do anything. But he was as quiet as he could be. His wife was never at a loss of words. And in fact, in the congregation, she was known as being bold and loud and boisterous. And evidently, she was that way at home too, because when it came time for her funeral, and, he was always a man, a few words and little emotion, and he was under control. And as we got to the cemetery, and he had, I think, a daughter on one side, and his son was on the other side. And the minister had said some nice things, 23rd Psalm, beautiful prayer, and so forth. I mean, as soon as he said amen, out of nowhere, there came a clap of thunder that shook the tent and a stroke of lightning. And when that settled down, he leaned over to his son and he says, "Well, she's there." Has it not been your experience that the funniest things happen in church? I kid you not. Oh, one reason I love the church. We're supposed to be talking about male spiritual leadership. Oh, I put in the church. I'm sorry. It's supposed to be in worship. This is a new presentation, by the way, so don't think that I've gone, repeating something. You see the text here. He gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors, that is elders, shepherds, some as teachers. And then in particular, as the verse continues on down, this passage goes all the way through 15, really 16. In fact, the paragraph, if I remember correctly, may extend, no, the new paragraph begins at verse 17. So it goes all the way through verse 16. He talks about a full-grown man, and he's talking about the church and its growth and maturity. We're applying it to ourselves as spiritual leaders in the church and in worship. There's a variety of roles. Not everyone can lead singing. I'm never asked to do that. Not everyone can preach and or teach in our Bible school program. Not everyone can lead prayers that moved the congregation because of their earnestness and sincerity, all of the things that we have the opportunity to do. But one of the absolute beauties from the wisdom of God is that if there is a place in the world where there is a place for every single person, from the eldest to the newest newborn that is brought in, just notice how the newborn attracts everybody's attention. That's a contribution right there, okay? That's an encouragement. If there's one place in the world where there's something for everyone and a place for everyone in the body, it's the Lord's church. Rob mentioned that in reference to 1 Corinthians 12. We have different parts of the body, but we all have the same function in the sense that we are glorifying God and serving one another, the ultimate goal to seeking to save the lost. All right, I want to discuss this by the time the half hour is over. We'll be on schedule. I want to give you a quality example of early male spiritual leadership in the church that I think would have also applied to those who were worship leaders. By the way, why is it that we know that leadership in worship is limited to the men? The very same reasons that we discussed in the home. The very first institution that the Lord established was the church, was rather the family. And the second institution that was the government. Every nation must have its own control, its own government. The laws of the state. And then the third, of course, is the church. And in the church, we come together for the purpose of worship. The very word worship has to do with the idea of worthiness. God is worthy. We are not the object of worship. And we've got to convince our people of that. We are not the objects of worship. We are the worshipers. And in the Lord's church, there's no such thing as clergy and laity. Yes. There are members. Yes. And there are members of the body of whom Christ is the head. And we are, wherever we fit in, the rest of the body, just like nothing hurts more at the time than either a quickie tooth or stumping your big toe. I mean, those are vital and important parts of the body, are they not? And so it is in the church as well. Example that impresses me so much. I have the opportunity in the fall to teach about 120 to 30 first-time freshmen in the life of Christ. And in the spring, simply the blessing of God Himself to teach that many in Acts of Apostles. We have those two courses as required courses for every single student, Henderson, Memphis, or Dixon. Before you can graduate with a Freed-Hardeman degree, you must have, among your liberal arts courses, Life of Christ and Acts of Apostles. You must know the Lord, not about the Lord, know the Lord, and you must know His bride. Boy, I love that passage in Ephesians 3:21, that through Christ and the church, God is to be glorified. You see, you don't have one or the other. A lot of people love the Lord, don't care for the church. Don't have the hope of heaven. I'm sorry. That's not what the book teaches. It's Christ and the church. And it is in the church that we worship as brethren, that we worship as members of the same body, going in the same direction. That's forward, yes, but ultimately upward, always. This early example, when we had the problem in Jerusalem, the very first problem that we are told of by Luke the beloved physician in the early church, the Grecian widows being neglected in what they called the daily distribution or the daily ministration. The Jews were a wonderful people when it came to taking care of their own people. Now, they didn't care for Samaritans. In fact, they despised them. And they hated Gentiles because they were of the world. And the Gentiles really had not had the exposure to 10 Commandments and the one God, Jehovah, of the Old Testament. And so, the Jews had no place for them. Peter, for instance, had never been in the home of a Gentile until God sent him directly to Cornelius. He had never taken anything unclean, according to Leviticus chapter 11, into his mouth, which is a commendation of him as a faithful, loyal Jew. He had never broken the law. Tells God that when he sends this sheet down from heaven. But when they have this problem in the early church, we're showing favoritism here on the Hebrew widows, Jewish widows, those who live in Jerusalem and Judea. And those who are still here from the observance of Pentecost and are members of the church and are from Greek-speaking countries, the Hellenistic Jews, they're not being treated fairly. Their needs are not being met. The complaint comes from that group. Every one of the 7 men that are selected in what is a preview of deacons, every one of the 7 men selected were from those Greek-speaking widows, because all the names are Greek. Stephen and Philip and Nicanor and Nicholas. And on they go. If you look at that passage in Acts 6. That's the best way, by the way, to solve a problem or to provide a solution. It is not unusual for a very fine student to come into my office or a member of my Bible faculty team. We have a fabulous group of guys. Sometimes they get a little strange, but they're preachers, so that's okay. Someone comes in and says, Brother Billy, we need to do so-and-so. I mean, we've got a problem here. The very first thing I do, I said, you're right. We do. Now, what do you propose that we do about that? I mean, they really think that the Bible department can solve every problem on the earth. They really do. And on that campus, we can't. But before we begin to study, what do you have in mind? And is it worthy of consideration? Well, the apostles were wise in saying, you choose 7 men from among you, full of wisdom. Well, first of all, men of good reputation. That is to say, now by the way, there's a difference in reputation and character. Reputation is what people think you are, and character is what you really are. You know it, the Lord knows it, and those who live with you know it. Those even who work with you know it. Although, you can hide some things from some people, but eventually life is going to reveal who you really are, what you really are, what you will do, where you will be on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Some people have been found dead in their homes. Why? Because they didn't show up for worship. Something's got to be wrong. And it was. That was exactly the reason they were not there. Only death could keep them away. Full of men of good reputation. In other words, spoken well of by everyone who knows them. Paul will later call it blameless when he's talking about elders. Doesn't mean they're perfect. It means there is no serious reason for us not to use them and to listen to them and to follow them. And then I love this one, full of the Spirit. I really believe, obviously, he's referring to the Holy Spirit and the miraculous measure of the Spirit that was available in the first century. We have what is called the natural, the normal, the ordinary presence of the Spirit in our lives today. But they were full of the Spirit, not just in the sense of miraculous gifts. They were full of the Spirit in terms they were spiritual. In other words, as we've talked about already, they were heaven-minded. 7 good men. And when you look at what Stephen did, and when you look at what Philip did in Acts 8, that's Philip the evangelist, not the apostle. Philip in that original group of 7. What Philip did down in Acts 21, the guy who has the 4 virgin daughters who are prophetesses in Caesarea, he'd been evangelizing that area of the Mediterranean coast all of those years. From chapter 8, the end of chapter 8, verse 40, all the way to chapter 21. That covered really decades, to tell you the truth. Full of the Spirit. They were heaven-minded. Number 3, men full of wisdom. Men who knew what to do. That's one thing. There's some men who know what to do, but they lack the second element of wisdom. How best to do it. Aristotle, 300 years before Christ, wrote a book that is still in print called Rhetoric. If any of you are communication teachers or communication students, you will know that the modern studies of communication are based still upon the rudimentary principles of Aristotle's Rhetoric. Now, we normally think of Aristotle as being a philosopher, and he was, but he was a communicator. And he says that there is a great difference between older men and younger men. And he says, younger men are ambitious, and younger men are enthusiastic, and younger men are energetic. And when they have an idea, they think it's the best idea that there's ever been, and why in the world can't we do it now? And they go to their employer, and he's an older man, and he sits there, and he listens, and he processes, and he analyzes, even before he speaks. And when he speaks with wisdom. What is that? Wisdom is the combination of knowledge, experience, and age. And the Lord said, those who are going to shepherd my flock are going to be just that kind of man. Not a novice, but someone who is full of wisdom. You know, they say about grandmothers, especially grandmothers in the church, that they are the best counselors in the world. They have no professional training because they don't need it. They've lived it. They have experienced. So you go to a wise woman, and it's also true of a wise man. Every decision, at least major decision, that I have made, and I'm not talking about back in the time of dating and all of that as to what girl to date and especially who to marry, I thought I could do that on my own observation and so forth. Prayed about it a lot. But in all the major decisions, I'm talking about knowing really nothing and not caring anything about business or money or those kinds of things. That's not who I am. It's not where I'm at. I would go to an elder in the church that I trusted, who did have that kind of background and who did know the right and the wrong thing to do and the right time and the wrong time and how that you could be taken advantage of being a guy like you, of the guys that are out there that are not always honest, you know? And so men who are full of wisdom. This is why sometimes that we have conflicts between young preachers and elders. This is why that we have problems sometimes between deacons and elders. It's not because the guys are so old that they don't want to do anything anymore. They just want to keep the doors open and that's all. That may be true in some places. It's called housekeeping for the Lord, you know. That's what that is. And that exists in too many places. But sometimes there's a wise man who says, that is a really good idea, but this is not the time for us to do that. I'm not going to forget the idea. I'm not going to forget you, but let me tell you why. That we need to wait on that just a little bit longer. I mean, how many times have been young guys come in and say, we can build this building. I've been there. We can build this building. We need this facility. We need it now. We needed it 10 years ago. But you know what? I'm not the one going to the bank and putting my name on the loan. And we need to respect that, and we need to revere that and appreciate that. I love these three qualities that are given. Qualifications of God's man. In Titus 1, when Titus is giving his qualifications for elders, if I could just borrow from that passage and apply it to male spiritual leadership and the way that we lead and worship. And by the way, brothers, I have known of men who the way they walk to the pulpit at the beginning of a worship service, the way they climb the steps, and the way that they position themselves behind the microphone in the pulpit and address the audience before they even say a word of welcome. They have set the tone for spiritual worship. I have also seen too many who did everything mechanically, almost as an assignment, without feeling and without this awe that we are in the presence of God. We've got to work on that. I'm not talking about putting on a show. I'm talking about being that kind of man that grows as a result of growing in the Lord, growing in the Word, growing in prayer. Tears coming down your cheeks sometimes when you hear voices much more beautiful than yours singing praises to God. You cannot keep it in what the hymns say and the way that those hymns are being sung. Yes. You know? Yes. We must be blameless at home. Notice the husband of one wife, children who believe and are not disobedient to parental authority, men who are blameless in public, verses 7 and 8 of chapter 1 of Titus describes an elder there as God's steward. Steward means this doesn't belong to you. God has placed you in position to take care of it for him. Just like our children. Yes, they're ours, but God has still given them to us. We could not have created them without him. And so God has given them to us for a period of time, and they belong to us. We are stewards. It doesn't belong to us, but God has allowed us to have it, just like this marvelous facility. Isn't it beautiful? How grateful we are for you, brethren, that are responsible, and for those who've gone before, who are responsible, and now for the care that is being taken care of it. Blameless. Notice, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine. Your body is the temple of God, and the wine then, no comparison to the wine today. So alcoholic beverages is a whole different discussion. Not pugnacious, you know what that means? Violent. In my own congregation, that has basically had a peaceful time, there was one time, after I'd left home, there was a problem that arose, and in a business meeting among the men, there were actually two men who raised their fist, ready to fight. Men who were spiritual leaders of that congregation. And men got between them and calmed them down. That's what he's talking about. Not violent. Not fond of sordid gain. The idea there is greed. Money is the only thing that defines me. And then he talks about we must be blameless in the church. Now, what are the virtues? When he's talking about in public, he's talking about vices. There were 5 vices there. Now he's got 6 virtues. Loving what is good, a supporter of good causes. Sensible, a man who has not only his mind, but of sound mind. The word sound from the Greek text means healthy. Healthy. Like sound doctrine, healthy. That which is according to the truth. It is the truth. Number 3, just. He must be just. That is to say, Not only is he in a righteous relationship with the Lord, he's in a righteous relationship with each other, with other people in the church. Now, these are qualifications for elders, but why should they not be applied to all of us who, given the task of leadership spiritually in the body, do not apply them to ourselves? And I tell you, preachers have to, or they won't be there very long. Devout, that has to do with godliness. Godliness. And then number 6, they must be self-controlled. They must keep themselves. Man, have I said things that I should not have said? Ooh. Last time was probably yesterday. I don't know that I've had enough time today. No, I'm talking about being in control of temper, of the way we think, the tongue that lashes out so easily, emotions, and let's face it, some have better control than others. This is one reason why that we need help from those who are older, who have been there, who have done that, who have mellowed, if you please, and now can speak wisely. And they can lead wisely. Okay. I want to suggest to you some qualities of God's man. I'm taking this from what you might consider, oh, it's noon, sorry, I've already violated my promise. I have 6 ideas here very quickly from the life of someone who never knew what it was like to be in the church. But when the Lord said, if you want to find a real man, you go listen to John the Baptizer. John is introduced to us in John chapter 3, as far as his birth is concerned, in Luke chapter 1. And you realize, before Luke chapter 1 is over, that what is going to be said by Luke about Jesus, advancing in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and man, the same is going to be said about John the Baptizer from a natural standpoint. The Lord was divine, yes, but John the Baptizer was going to be that kind of man as well. And Zacharias and Elizabeth wondered, what is this son going to turn out to be? I bet Joseph and Mary wondered that a few times too, about Jesus. But when the Lord commends in chapter 11 the preaching, teaching, and life, even while John was still in prison, he talks about him being a man of sincerity. What did you expect to hear when you went out to hear John? You heard the truth. And if you were a Pharisee or you were a Sadducee leaving Jerusalem and coming down to the Jordan River to see why all these multitudes are going down there, leaving the temple and going to hear John preach, and then to be baptized in water that is of sufficient depth to immerse, which was for the forgiveness of sins. Yes. Sincerity means there's absolutely no impurity. It's kind of like the water we drink, the milk we drink. In Nashville in Middle Tennessee, the Purity Milk Company is owned by the Ezel family, longtime members of the church. I thought, what a great name for a milk company, Purity, because I certainly don't want any impurity in it. Ivory used to advertise back in the days when they didn't have pharmaceuticals taking over the commercial world. They used to advertise 99 and 44, 100% pure. And I'm thinking, okay, what is wrong with that other, 56% of that bar of soap? I mean, or, 0.56%. Sincerity. You know a sincere person when you've been around them enough and dealt with them enough. Genuine. What you see is what you get. He also made it plain in what he spoke. Saw these people coming, and he says, why have you come down here, you brood of vipers? And even a college student knows that a viper is not only a snake, it is a poisonous snake. It is a deadly snake. And so how would you like to be looking into the eyeballs? Do you think John was looking over here at this wall and back there at the back of the roof or ceiling and over here at this wall? He's looking at them eyeball to eyeball. You generation of vipers. And then later, Jesus himself will say, if people listen to you, they're twice as likely to go to hell than if they'd not heard at all. I'll tell you what, that'll get you crucified. That will get you crucified. His message was simple. It was easy to understand. People obeyed it. He was a man of conviction. Jesus says, when you went out to hear John preach, what did you expect to see? Did you expect to see a reed blowing in the wind? Do you remember that presidential candidate that is remembered for testing the wind? Every audience that he addressed. Let's see which way the wind's blowing in Chicago. Let's see which way the wind's blowing in Birmingham. Let's see which way the wind's blowing in Dallas and in LA and in Seattle and back to New York. And the message changed accordingly. Now, it's true that the gospel applies to every situation, but listen, guys, it's the same message. It's the same message for every audience. And it's not watered down. We do nobody a favor if we don't tell them the truth. I'm not talking about being ugly. I'm talking about speaking the truth in love. Ephesians 4:15. Great passage. But notice, truth is first. The way we do it, love, is second. If we want to save people. And again, they get you crucified. He was a man of conviction. And Jesus says, no, you didn't see a reed blowing in the wind. Message depended on whichever way the wind was blowing. No, that wasn't John. You didn't see someone in nice apparel either. Guy's wardrobe was camel skin. He ate locusts and wild honey. What is wrong with him? He had very simple needs. He was all about the mission God brought him in the world to do. And you know what? If you have enough conviction, if you have the right conviction, you cannot help but being courageous. Let me tell you a sad story. When we bring someone in as a candidate to teach Bible, in fact, we do this, not to the degree in Bible, but in every department of our school, we have a spiritual or a doctrinal questionnaire that they have. In Bible, that could be a 2-hour, 3-hour, in one case, 2 whole days of discussions from which we came away saying, listen, if we ever have to go through that again, we know from the get-go that guy is not suitable for our team. Well, we had one such guy, very good man, done a lot of good things, but when we got to the point of discussing divorce and remarriage, I asked him, where do you stand? There was a time where the church was not divided on this. Today, the church is divided. It's going to get worse. And I said, do you teach Matthew 19:9? Do you teach Matthew 5:32? Do you teach 1 Corinthians 7 and Romans 7? With sadness, he dipped his head. He said, I should have the courage to do that. When he left and we did not hire him, I said to my colleague who witnessed the conversation, if he had the conviction, he would also have the courage. If the conviction is not there, neither is the courage. What did you expect to see when you went out to hear John preach? If you're going to call Pharisees and Sadducees vipers, and they're eventually going to behead you, even though that was at the head of Herod Antipas, you're going to be courageous. Matthew 14:4 is where he says about his relationship with Herodotus, the wife of Antipas' brother Philip. You cannot have her. It is not according to the law. I've heard some of our brethren say, well, we don't know what law he was talking about. Yeah, I do. The law of Moses is what he was talking about. What other law was there for the Jew? The law of Moses conducted both spiritual life. In fact, they didn't know any difference between spiritual life and secular life.
Amen. Yes,
There was no difference.
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
They must be men of vision. The Lord says, you know, when it comes to men, there's never been anyone born of woman that is greater than John the Baptizer. Now, he would not be included in that because, yes, born of woman, but not of father conception, not of earthly father conception. But of those born of both father and mother in the earthly sense, none greater than John. The Bible doesn't spend a great deal of time complimenting Dave. It just says things the way they are. I can't think of a better tribute in all the Bible than that. And so, was he going to be able to enter the kingdom? No. But he pointed everybody to the kingdom. I am not the light. He is the light. He is the one whose shoes I cannot carry. Forward, forward, forward. Everything was about the Lord. We must be everything about the Lord too. And then finally, humility. In this chapter of Matthew 11, one of my favorites, Jesus teaches us a fabulous lesson about how to respond to unfair, unjust criticism. John had his weaknesses too. He was imprisoned. He probably knew that he was going to die. Sooner or later, he wasn't worried about that. He was worried about the kingdom. And so he sends messengers to Jesus in the midst of his very busy Galilean ministry. Are you the expected one or not? Or do we look for somebody else? Can you imagine? Earlier he had said, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. And now he's saying, are you the guy, or do we need to look for somebody else? Imagine saying that to the Lord. And Jesus doesn't raise his voice. I can hear it in Scripture. He says, I want you to go back to John. I understand where John's coming from. There's God's timetable for things, and there's our timetable for things, and they don't always mesh. And so I want you to go back and tell John, and he quotes two passages, one from Isaiah 45:5 and one from Isaiah 61:1. Two passages that have to do, you go back and tell John how that the blind can see, the deaf can hear. Can we do any of that today, by the way? The blind can see, the deaf can hear, the lame can walk. Those with leprosy are cleansed. And those who have died have been raised from the dead. That is to say, there have been more examples of that than we have record of in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm convinced. We have enough to show that the Lord had the power over everything, even before he went to the cross. And then he says what to me is a sad statement of how he must felt. He says to all those who heard this conversation, blessed is the man who does not stumble because of me. Bless his heart. How could Jesus cause anybody to stumble? The Lord reveals his own humility there. But John is showing his humility in asking the question. He was not perfect. He didn't have all the answers. He knew he wasn't the Christ. He knew he was subjected to the leadership of the Lord, but there were things he didn't understand. And you know to whom he took it? To his disciples? No, he took it to the Lord himself. He asked the Lord himself. And when there are things that you and I do not understand, let's begin by going to the Lord. Okay? Let's begin by going to the Lord. Josiah Gilbert Holland was a gentleman who wrote a poem that I don't have time for us to read or quote. But it's called God Give Us Men. And the next line is, God give us men. The times demand it. And there has never been a time that I'm aware of in studying church history where the church has not had its issues, its divisions, or its crises. It's because it's made up of human beings. Only heaven is perfect. But if we're going to make it through the various issues, divisions, and present to the Lord when He returns the church in all of her glory, then we've got to step up. And I want to say in closing, thank you for who you are and for what you are. Being here today, most of you are probably elders. And without knowing you, I tell people when I meet them, I love you because even as a preacher, I do not know the depths of your work. But I know it is the hardest work in the world. I also know it is the greatest work in the world. I really believe that. Somebody else can have the White House. I don't care about that. But people leading the Lord's people, who are we going to remember? We're going to remember those folks that are in Hebrews chapter 11 and others that the Hebrews writer didn't have time for. I know what you're thinking. We don't have any more time right now. They were busy then too, okay? But listen, the people that wind up in Hebrews 11 are the people who live by faith and not by sight.
Yes.
And faith doesn't mean there, I don't know so. It means I know because of what has been promised to me, because of what has been revealed to me. That's what faith is in the Bible. And may the Lord bless all of us to have and develop these qualities. Think about how many qualities we could discern from Jesus' life. But here is a commendation of Jesus toward a real man, and not just a real man, a real spiritual man who needs to lead when he stands here and when he stands behind this table and when he stands up to lead in prayer and when he encourages folks out in the lobby and when he takes care of people outside of this building who do not have the opportunity to be here at this building, and they'd give anything if they could come. And especially the person who has on their heart the burden of a lost world, getting more so with the passing of every moment. That's the kind of man that will be Spirit-led and Spirit-driven. And may the Lord bless us to continue our growth in the greatest work in all the world.
Thank you so much, Billy. I'm really looking forward to the congregation here enjoying and sitting at your feet tomorrow morning. We're so thankful for each one of you. I'm thankful for the elders here and the members here who have worked to make this day possible, the food that's been prepared for us. And especially I'm thankful for each congregation that's represented here. I hope that through events like this we can